If you are watching this as a recording at some point in the future, though, you should stop right now and go watch the first one first if you haven't already. Although there will be a playlist that will show them all in order. So hopefully you got them in order. Welcome back, whether you're here with us on Zoom or in person. Thanks for being with us. Session 2. Last week, I did a short introduction to the Bible in general, its structure, and then we talked about the first book of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the book of Genesis. This week, we pick up with the second book of the Bible, and therefore the second book of Torah, the book of Exodus. Now, when we left off in Genesis, we had been following this family, right? Abraham and Sarah and their son Isaac and his son Jacob. We didn't talk so much about Esau. He's not the central character of the story. And Jacob has many sons, as well as daughters not named in Scripture. And we focused especially on Joseph, Jacob's youngest son. Joseph going down to Egypt in slavery, but ultimately finding a position of prominence and able to welcome his family during a famine. And so this entire family, and we've been following their story since Genesis chapter 12, they enter Egypt, and initially, probably living during the 15th dynasty, they're welcomed into Egypt as actually honored guests, right? That's where we left off in Genesis. Now, as we enter Exodus, though, we sort of rocket forward many hundreds of years. We have to guess with these years, but if we think that Joseph was perhaps in Egypt sometime around maybe 1550 BC, 1600 BC, whoever the historical figure of Joseph might be based on, right? And our scriptural passages likely have changes and legendary accretions, but if we think that there's a core historical personality there around 1600 or 1550 BC, as we move forward into Exodus, we're looking at probably maybe 1300 or 1200 BC, that kind of time frame. So we shoot forward many centuries. And things have changed for the Israelites in Egypt. The Hyksos dynasty or the Hyksos dynasty that probably had welcomed the Israelites and seen them as allies has fallen. They didn't last very long. And as indigenous rulers take over in Egypt, they are not big fans of these Hebrews. And indeed, they become enslaved. Right off the bat in chapter 1, these people have been returned to a state of slavery, just as their now distant ancestor Joseph had been. This brings us to the next character in our story, a man, or at first a boy, named Moses, who is a descendant of Jacob, a descendant of Israel. And he's a descendant through the man Levi, so of Jacob's 12 sons. One was Levi. So Moses is a Levite, a descendant of Levi. He's in a tribe or the house of Levi. But Moses has a rough start to life. And the short version is that the Pharaoh, the king or the emperor of Egypt, is concerned about how many Hebrews, how many Israelites there are in his land. And so he orders midwives to actually kill some of the male children of the Hebrews to keep their population down. Luckily for Moses, the midwives responsible for assisting his mother refused to do this, but they and his mother realized that once this is discovered by the Egyptian authorities, Moses will likely be seized and killed. So they place him in a sort of basket, more like a box, and they float him down the river Nile, hoping that someone finds him and takes mercy on him. And luckily for them, this indeed does happen. There's an Egyptian woman, a princess, so someone sort of in the household or the court of Pharaoh, and she finds the boy, she takes mercy upon him, and she raises him as her own, although she is aware that he's a Hebrew, and indeed Moses knows that he is also a Hebrew man. So he's raised in an Egyptian family, but he knows his real identity. It is worth pointing out, though, that Moses is an Egyptian name, it is not a Hebrew name, and it just means son, S-O-N, so like a male child. Not S-U-N, like the star at the center of our solar system, right? That's a pun that only works in English. It just means son. And you've heard this name before. If you've heard of an Egyptian pharaoh named Ramses or Rameses II, and indeed we think that Rameses II might have been ruling during Moses's life, Ra-Meses means son of Ra, son of a god associated with the sun. So here we have a Hebrew man with an Egyptian name, raised in an Egyptian household, and indeed a household of prominence, but he knows his identity and he knows the fate and the state of his people. And here's a sort of nice kind of Sunday school type picture that many of us saw growing up of there's the Egyptian aristocratic woman finding Moses and taking him in. And it's worth pointing out that the Hebrew name for the basket or the box that Moses is in is the same word that's used for Noah's Ark, for the giant boat. And it's the same word that would have been used for the Ark of the Covenant, which we'll talk about. So there's a play on words here that we lose in the English translation because we don't call this an ark, but they're playing on these themes. Just as Noah was saved on the ark during the Great Flood, likewise Moses has been saved on the flood of the Nile with a smaller ark. Which really just means box. Okay, but Moses, of course, grows up. He knows his identity as an Israelite, and there's a situation in which an Egyptian man is abusing, beating up a Hebrew man, an Israelite. Moses intervenes and ends up murdering the Egyptian. I guess he would say he was acting in defense of his fellow Israelite, but they all know that the Egyptian authorities are not going to see it this way. So Moses decides to flee. He's a fugitive, right? He runs east into the Sinai, past the Sinai Isthmus, into the Sinai Peninsula, that region between really Africa and the Asian continent, between today's Egypt and today's state of Israel and Palestine. And he ends up joining us community there of herders, of shepherds. And probably Moses expects to stay there for quite a while, maybe his whole life, maybe not, but certainly for a long time. He knows if he goes back to Egypt, he's going to likely be arrested and executed. So he's on the lam. But while he's out there, he has this strange experience, right? One of the most famous passages from the Hebrew Bible. He's walking along and he sees a bush, right? And this is a desert area, but there are plants, there's some vegetation. He sees a bush and it's burning. Now, the fact that the bush is burning is not itself that strange. It's very dry there, so a lightning strike could ignite a bush or trees. Well, we know all about that here in the United States, especially in the West Coast, about forest fires. But what is strange is that as the bush burns, it's not consumed. So it doesn't burn into ash or dust. The bush just stays there and seems to still be alive and nothing happens to it. So this fire is strange and it catches Moses' attention. So he turns to look. And as he turns, this voice comes and speaks to Moses. So there's this divine voice. Moses has this divine encounter. This is Moses's call, such an important moment, not only in his life, but in the life of the Israelite people. Now, Moses has questions, and this chapter 3 and chapter 4 are really important. So again, a reminder, we are not doing any detailed analysis of the text, but if you're curious to sort of dip your toe into certain parts of scripture, I would urge you to maybe start with chapter 3 of Exodus. It's such an important passage of scripture. There's so much going on here. We could do 4 weeks on just this chapter, okay? But we're not doing that. That's not what we're doing. So we're going to continue to move forward. I'm going to talk about 2 quick things, but just know there's so much more to discuss. As I said, this is not a course on theology itself, but there's such a rich theology going on in chapter 3 of Exodus. So again, I commend this to you. But there are 2 basic things that happens here. Again, here's a nice image there of Moses in the burning bush. And Moses is astounded. And hopefully you can see there. I know on the projector it's blocked. I should be able to get rid of that. There we go. I hope that you can see he has his sandals off, right? The voice tells him, remove your sandals for you are on holy ground. Moses is having a divine encounter. But as I said, Moses has questions, right? And the main question that Moses has is, who are you? Who are you? You have to remember that Moses is living in a time when just about everyone in the whole world is polytheistic. They believe not in one God, but in many, many gods, dozens, even hundreds or thousands of gods. They expect a different God for different places, right? Each place, each city, each town, each river, each mountain would have its own divinity. They expect different gods to be in charge of different natural phenomena, a god of fire, a god of seas, a god of the air, a god of storms. There are gods even they're in control of certain social realities or ideas, a god of love, a god of war. Right, so Moses is going to basically ask, all right, divine voice, identify yourself. Who are you? In other words, what kind of God are you? What power do you have? Right? And God does respond. This is the first thing. God does identify God's self. The first thing, it's actually there's different order here, but the first thing I want to say is that God does identify God's self as the God of Moses's people. God says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm the God of your great, 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 great grandfathers. And I'm the God who's in a special relationship with your family. And he makes that point. God makes that point. But it doesn't stop there. And it's very crucial that it doesn't stop there. God goes on, and at one point in Hebrew says, Aya Asher Aya, which means something like, I am who I am, or I am becoming who I will become. The Hebrew allows for various tenses of the verbs here. But I am who I am. Now, as an answer to the question of who are you, this is an extremely unhelpful answer, right? Anyone could say this. Who are you? Well, I am who I am. Well, thank you. That's not at all helpful. But there's a reason God is speaking this way. And God will go on. When God gives, quote, a name, we get a name that we might pronounce as Yahweh, although we actually don't know how the name is pronounced. On your screen, you'll see these four letters, YHWH. The way that Hebrew is written is we have those consonants. The vowels have been removed in the actual writing of the Hebrew text over the millennia. So we don't actually know which vowels go along with that. But our best guess would be that the name is Yahweh. But Yahweh means something like he who is. So it's really just another way of saying I am who I am. It's not actually a name. It's a name that's not a name. Now, in the context of Moses' question, this is super important because remember, Moses is asking, what are you responsible for, God? Which God are you? Are you the God of this place? Are you the God of this bush? Are you the God of fire? Are you the God of bushes in general? Like, what power do you have? What can you do for me, in other words, right? If you're the God of water, maybe you can send me rain. If you're the God of this land, maybe you can help me, survive here. So what do you offer? And by refusing to answer the question, the implicit message, and again, this is taking us down the route of the deep theology of this text, which is very worth our attention and I love to discuss, but I won't now. But what God is essentially saying here, right, is I'm just the God of everything. I'm not the God of this place or that thing or that idea or this natural phenomenon. I'm the God of all things. So notice there's a tension here. On the one hand, this is the God of this people. This God has a particular relationship with the Israelites, but also this is the God of all things, the Lord of creation, the Lord of the whole world. And this is a radical maneuver. There will be other communities around this time, including even in Egypt, that begin to wonder about the possibility of being monotheistic. But this is really sort of the first time we get this sort of big claim that there's really just one divine power in the world. Today, that's sort of the default expectation among many people around the world, not all. At the time, it was a radical idea, a really radical pronouncement. But I said that in chapters 3 and going into chapter 4, God does something else. God doesn't just identify God's self. God gives Moses a mission, right? Famously tells Moses, go back to Egypt where you fled from, where you are a fugitive from. Go back to Egypt and free your people from slavery, right? I've heard the cries of the Israelites. They need to get out of there. No more being enslaved for these people. Now, Moses is sort of, I think, without a doubt, sort of the central figure, certainly of Torah and arguably of the whole Hebrew Bible. I think probably the most famous Jewish prophet, perhaps the most notable, the most important. Okay, this towering figure in Jewish history, and he does everything to get out of it. He does not want this mission. He does not want this importance. He really tries to avoid God's call. And God does not say, look, do it or else, I'm the boss. God negotiates. God says, well, look, I'll be with you. You will have my assistance in this. And Moses receives a staff as a sort of sign of God's divine presence and the ability to work miracles. And God says, look, your brother Aaron, maybe he's a better public speaker, right? Maybe he's more charismatic leader. He can help you. You guys can work as a team. Last week, we talked about this idea that oftentimes God and humanity there's a struggle, there's a fight. God has a dream and a vision for this world, but God doesn't actually attempt to impose it on humanity. We get that idea sometimes when we read Hebrew scripture, but if we read closely, we pay attention, that's not what's going on here. Instead, God is asking for humanity to join God in the work, to cooperate, to choose to be in harmony with God's mission. And Moses was willing to debate, just as Moses debated Abraham, just as God debated Abraham, just as God wrestled with Jacob, just as God favored Joseph and yet threw him into this very difficult situation. Likewise, Moses and God, they wrestle here. And it won't be the last time. It won't be the last time that they get frustrated at one another. Ultimately, though, Moses, right, accepts the mission. And he finds his brother Aaron, and he re-enters Egypt, and they go to Pharaoh, sort of demanding the freedom of their people. Well, they show up, chapter 5, and they go to Pharaoh, the emperor, the king of Egypt, and they say, "Hey, Pharaoh, our God says you need to free our people." And Pharaoh, not surprisingly, is having none of it. Doesn't know what God they're talking about, right? And they probably tell him something weird about God is just the one who is, and Pharaoh thinks this is a bunch of crazy mumbo jumbo, right? Pharaoh knows there are lots of gods, and Pharaoh probably thinks he himself is a god. So this sort of vague talk about the one who is doesn't interest him at all. And like most people who enslave people, he really doesn't want to free those people because he's making a lot of money off them, a lot of wealth. So God expected this, and God has a plan to convince Pharaoh to let the people go. Again, notice that even the bad guy here, God kind of negotiates with Pharaoh. So we get these 10 plagues, but God starts out with sort of the milder plagues. They're not good, right? They're plagues, but God sort of ramps it up, hoping that maybe Pharaoh will relent. Now, there is a debate here. There are parts of the text that suggest that God actually sort of intentionally makes Pharaoh resistant to God's call, but there are other chapters within this same section that suggest that Pharaoh chooses to be resistant. There's a debate there. An important debate. We can't dive in right now, but I just wanted to name that. But the overall picture, right, is that God is sending these plagues hoping that Pharaoh will listen and will relent and will change his mind. So we get these 10 plagues, chapters 5 through 11 of Exodus. We get things like the river running red with blood, which could be intended to be literally blood, or it might be a way of referring to a sort of red clay mud that would come down. But even if it's just clay mud, that would have a huge impact on the agriculture of Egypt. So it would still be a bad thing. Swarms of frogs, swarms of stinging insects, swarms of gnats, all kinds of nasty things. And there's a slow kind of ramping up of how bad, how annoying, how damaging, how violent these plagues are. But ultimately, through at least the first 9 plagues, Pharaoh refuses to relent, right? It's costing him. It's certainly causing problems for his people, but Pharaoh refuses to relent. But God has another card to play. And here's again a nice sort of a classic kind of mid-20th century image there of Moses, his staff, his brother Aaron there to our right, to Moses's left, dressed in that garb of shepherds. Right, and there's Pharaoh and the queen, and they're dressed, of course, with great opulence, lots of gold. Moses demanding the freedom of his people. So Pharaoh has refused. In chapter 12, we learn that God has a final move. And the sense that we get is that God had hoped to not have to play this card. And again, different commentators will debate that interpretation. But the sense I get from the narrative is that this is not something God wanted to do, but finally there are no more cards to play. So God sends the last and the worst and the most devastating plague. All the firstborn males of the land of Egypt will die in one night. The angel of death will come, and all the firstborn males will die. And this will finally force Pharaoh's hand. Now, of course, God is trying to liberate the Israelites of the Hebrews, so he doesn't want to kill their children. And so God gives Moses this command. Look, tell the people that first off, they need to get ready to leave. And secondly, you're going to slaughter a lamb, and you're going to cook the lamb and eat the lamb as you would during a holiday. This time, most people would only have been able to eat meat on high holidays. It wasn't common. But you're going to take some of the blood of this animal, and you're going to smear it over the door frame of your home. And that'll be a ritual sign to the angel of death to not visit your home and to not therefore bring death to the firstborn of your house. And so this night is known as the Passover because the angel of death passed over the homes of the Israelites who had marked their door in this way. But there's even more going on here, right? They're also told to get dressed in the nighttime, to prepare this meal, but also to prepare bread for the journey. But they don't have time to raise the bread, to put yeast in the bread and leaven it, which takes many hours. They have to cook flat cakes, which are, if you've ever had totally flattened bread with no leavening in it, not quite as tasty as nice fluffy bread. But they don't have a lot of time, right? God recognizes that even if Pharaoh relents and frees them, Pharaoh might change his mind. Spoiler warning. So they've got to get ready, and when they get the word that they can leave, they've just got to get moving, because indeed Pharaoh will change his mind. Now, of course, the Passover is not just a historical event or a scriptural story. It remains, I think, arguably the highest of the Jewish high holy days even to this day. And many of you, if you have Jewish friends or neighbors, you may have been invited to a Passover feast. And the story is recounted, and again, Jewish people will often cook flat bread, unleavened bread, and only eat unleavened bread during the week of Passover as a remembrance of this journey. So if you've ever seen like matzah or things sold right around Easter time, that's what's going on here, right? There's a ritual remembrance of this event. Very important moment, of course, in Israelite history and in the story of Scripture. And here's a Jewish family marking their door frame, so the angel of death will pass over their home and not visit them. Well, it has the intended effect. Indeed, Pharaoh's own son dies, and finally he relents and says, look, just get out, just go. I'm sick of dealing with you. And so the Israelites indeed get up, and they move out, and they head east towards the wilderness that indeed Moses had been living in, but of course also in the direction of Canaan, where their distant ancestor Abraham had lived so many centuries before. And again, this is not just a past event, but it is such an important moment for Jewish people today as well. All right, so the Hebrews are on the move. They're heading to freedom. They're no longer enslaved. Things are looking good. But as I said, Pharaoh changes his mind and realizes that maybe this is the last plague. Maybe this strange god has played his last card, and Pharaoh can keep these slaves and continue to exploit them to his benefit. So he gets his chariots ready, and he chases the Hebrews into the eastern wilderness with a great army. Now, the Israelites are now free, but they're not soldiers, and they don't have any weapons, right? And they've got men and women and children, young and old, with them. They're in no position to fight. And as they move east, they come up against the body of water, possibly one of the arms of the Red Sea, possibly another body of water in the area. We'll look at a map in a little bit. But it doesn't matter to them which body of water it is. It's a body of water, and they cannot all swim across this with thousands of people, perhaps in this caravan. So they are in trouble. They have an army to their west, this huge body of water to their east. They're trapped. But again, God is with them. God has a plan, or at least God is ready to respond and change the plan as needed. And in Exodus 14 and 15, we hear the famous passage of a great wind coming forth and spreading the waters to either side, creating a sort of muddy but walkable path for the Hebrews to walk through to safety. As the Egyptian army tries to chase them into that channel, though, the waters return and many of the army are drowned. In their desire to bring violence to the Hebrews, they themselves are killed. Here's actually a more contemporary image, late 20th century image of this Moses spreading the waters with his staff in hand. The staff, which was a symbol of his authority and his being chosen by God for this particular mission. So now the Israelites are finally really free. They're out of Egypt, they're into the Sinai Peninsula. Slavery is over. That's great. But they immediately realize there's a huge problem, because the Sinai Peninsula, then as now, is a dry and desolate place. You can't really farm there. There's not a lot of food. Indeed, there's barely even any water. So immediately the Israelites start to complain against Moses. Hey, Moses, you freed us, but what's the point? We're all just going to die out here of thirst or hunger. But again, what we learn is that God continues to be with them, and God provides, first guiding Moses and the people to various springs of water in the area so that they will not die of thirst, but then also ultimately bringing them food. Each night, we're told that There are actually some kind of birds, maybe sort of pheasant-like birds, kind of ground birds that are blown in that the people are able to capture and cook. But even more significantly, there's this other strange substance. Maybe it's kind of like a flaky bread, or maybe it's more like a seed. We're not sure. But it blows in each night, and they're able to collect it and eat it and sustain themselves. And the Hebrews also don't know. We don't know what this thing was supposed to have been. The name that they give to it in Hebrew, manna, literally means "what is it?" So they don't know what it is, but it's good to eat, and God has provided it, and that's all that matters to them. So this early period in the wilderness is marked by their concern and anxiety, but also God sort of providing for them. But just enough. They're told they can only gather enough each day for that day. They'll have to wait to receive what they need for the next day on the next day. So they're free and they're in the wilderness, but God's plan is not to leave these people wandering the wilderness forever. There's a further mission, right? The idea here is that these people can return to the land that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had lived in prior. So just as Abraham came from probably the northwest to Canaan to settle there, likewise now his distant descendants will come from the southeast to return to this home. And whatever mission God has for these people, God needs them to sort of be in that land and to sort of be free and to be settled so they can do whatever work God has for them, which we touched on last week and we'll talk more about as we go forward. So the idea here is they enter the wilderness in order to get to this new home. The wilderness is not a permanent place to stay. But there's work to do to prepare to live in that new home, or that old home, depending on how you want to look at it. And so the next stop is going to be at Mount Horeb. But I do have a map here for you. Now, this is one of many proposed routes. If you Google Exodus map, you will find many thousands of different maps, all different kinds of theories about the route that the folks may have taken. And I'm not suggesting that this is the right one. I just thought this was a clear one. Mostly, I'm encouraging you to look more at the general geography. Egypt is on the left side of your map here. And the people were probably living actually in that northeastern quadrant of Egypt at the delta of the Nile, that place where the Nile spreads out and there's a lot of fertile land. They headed east, and you can see that this map is suggesting that the water they crossed was this arm of the Red Sea known as the Gulf of Aqaba. But it could have been one of these bodies of water. Let me use my mouse. One of these bodies of water much closer to Egypt, or even this other arm of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Suez. And people debate this, and I'm here to say I have absolutely no idea, and I don't think it's particularly important. The point is they were trapped, and God helped them to escape. But you can see the sort of wandering route they take, and according to Scripture, they take 40 years to cross this distance. Well, it's a distance of maybe 200 or 250 miles. It doesn't take 40 years to cross that distance, but there is this long period of wandering. And there is a purpose to that wandering. So Moses and the people come to Mount Horeb in the Sinai, and Moses goes up the mountain to commune with God, to have a meeting with God, and indeed we're told to meet God face to face, a strange encounter. But Moses and a few others will go up the mountain. Most of the people stay down at the base of the mountain to wait. This is Exodus chapter 20. Now, in this encounter, we finally start to get the law. Now, I said that the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible are referred to as Torah, as law: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And that's true, but you may have noticed that in Genesis, we discussed basically no law. There was really no law in Genesis. And so far in Exodus, we've had narrative, not actual legal code. Here, the legal code begins to actually arrive. So Torah proper begins to arrive. And of course, we get the summary of the law. The 10 Commandments are sort of an introduction or a summary of the meaning of Torah as a whole. Now, the law eventually comes to have, if I remember correctly, 613 specific regulations. So these 10 are just meant as a summary, though. In a sense, they cover the basic meaning of all those 613 regulations. Those guides to daily life are summarized in the 10 Commandments, and they are inscribed on these 2 stone tablets, very famously. Now, again, we've talked about the importance of covenant. We talked about the covenant between Noah and God, that God would never again sort of flood the whole world and destroy the world. We talked about the covenant, especially between Abraham and God, that if Abraham followed God and listened to this strange command to go out and move to Canaan, that Abraham would be blessed with many descendants. So the idea of covenant has already been established, that God comes to people and sort of strikes a deal. If you do this, I can give this back for you. Let's work together. And with Moses on Mount Horeb, a new covenant arrives, which we indeed often call the Mosaic covenant, the covenant between God and Moses. And Torah is what God is asking the people to do. Live in this way. If you live in this way, then things will go well for you, and I will be able to be with you and help you to succeed. But you have to live your half of the covenant. And law is the Torah, the law is showing the people how they ought to live. Right? Live in harmony with each other and live in harmony with me, with God. And there will be peace and prosperity. And we can get to this other mission that I have for you, which, by the way, we will discuss. Again, here's another famous kind of probably, I don't know, early or mid 20th century image. Was Moses looking very imposing with his 2 tablets, right? And there's God kind of throwing some lightning down for good measure, good dramatic effect, right? Now, chapters 21 to 31 actually contain some specific legal code. We finally get some specifics about if this, then that, do this, don't do that. Here's how to live. Here's how to build this community. And we can break Torah up in general into 2 basic spheres of interest. On the one hand, we have what we might call interpersonal human ethics, how to treat other human beings. Chapters 21 through 23, so 3 chapters, focus on that. Give us a sort of expanded summary from the 10 Commandments about how to treat other human beings. But we also get what we might call liturgical law, or how humans ought to relate to God, so how to worship. And actually, this section here is actually much longer, chapters 24 to 31. So I think that's 7 or 8 chapters. I'm not a math whiz. A long section that details regulations about sacrifice, regulations about prayer, and specifically begins to also discuss sort of building certain furniture for worship, like how to put together a place to worship together, how to put together an altar, how to put together an incense burner, what kind of clothing should the priest wear. And the text goes into quite a bit of detail about this. Very concerned about sort of liturgical ethics or liturgical law. And we'll find this same split throughout the rest of Torah. The books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy do have some narrative, but they're mostly focused on actually the legal code. And most of the laws you'll find you can kind of assign either to the interpersonal human ethics side of things, how to treat other people, right? Don't murder them, don't steal their stuff, etc. Or the divine human relationship, how to pray properly, how to sacrifice properly, how to organize communal worship properly, how to live in harmony with each other, and how to live in harmony with God. So all this is going on, and this is all great. The covenant's getting made, right? Moses and God are having a power meeting. They're getting a lot of work done. It's all good. So down below, though, the people are getting anxious and restless. They were already anxious about being in the wilderness in the first place. We already saw that. Worried about where they're getting their food, worried about where they're getting their water. Not so sure about this Moses guy. Yeah, he freed them, but he's kind of a wild dude. And he's talking about this God that they probably hadn't really been worshiping actively for quite a while. They're not really sure what's going on here. It's likely that they had been involved in a lot of polytheistic worship in Egypt. That was the norm there. So they're not really sure if they trust this guy and his God. And they get really nervous. And indeed, they decide that Moses has been up on the mountain way too long. Maybe they've abandoned us, right? We need to identify a different divine power to help us, to save us, to preserve us. So they gather up a lot of their precious metal, they melt it down, and they create
a golden statue of a calf.
And they worship it. Now, the idea here is not that they're worshiping the statue. They realize that they've made the statue, but in their understanding of divinity, you need some kind of physical item to sort of focus the presence of a god or a deity. So they're sort of thinking, well, again, remember that at this time, people thought there were all kinds of gods in the world. And they assume there must be some gods sort of living in this place, gods of this mountain or gods of this valley or some other divine power. People at this time thought that there were just sort of divine personalities sort of scattered around the world. You could sort of discover new ones, meet new ones, make a relationship with new one. And indeed, it's worth pointing out that's sort of what Moses did, right? So they create this golden calf and they hope that some God will sort of come, will notice it, and will sort of enter into relationship with them. They can worship the God through this statue, and they can then receive some kind of protection or guidance from this. Now, the calf, it's just worth pointing out briefly because we'll come up against this again. Bulls, cattle, and cows were common religious symbols in Egypt and indeed throughout what we call sort of the Near and Middle East and on into South Asia as well. It may seem strange for a Western audience today to think of a cow as an object of worship, but in Egypt, this is actually quite common. And so this shape makes sense. And as we'll see later in Canaanite religion, a bull or a cow or a calf is a common religious image that actually is associated with divine power. So that's why they chose that particular animal. It was common at that time and place to associate cattle with divine powers. So Aaron, Moses' brother, goes rogue and actually helps them to cast this calf. They're worshiping it, or they're trying to worship a deity through it. And here's a kind of, this is probably, I don't know, maybe a late Renaissance, early modern kind of Western depiction of them worshiping. In this case, it looks more like a bull than a calf, to be honest, but there you go. And I think this is probably Aaron here dressed in white saying, look at what I've done. So Aaron is pleased with himself, but Moses and God are not. Moses comes down and is shocked by what these people are doing, right? The very first commandment on the stone tablets that he's holding, right, is I am the Lord your God, have no other gods before me. And yet here the people are worshiping this statue. Moses is mad. God presumably is not pleased. Moses actually smashes the tablets in his anger. And it's a bad scene. Now, another copy of the Ten Commandments will be made, and it's worth pointing out that it's slightly different than the first set, but not substantially so. Another copy will be made, so that issue will be fixed. But a pattern has been set here, right, between God and the people. God comes offering this covenant, asking the people to sort of come halfway, as it were, but repeatedly the people will refuse to really fulfill the covenant. We already saw a bit of this earlier on when people were hesitant and worried about where their food and water is going to come from. We see it again here. At the minute Moses goes off for a few days or a week or two, they're back to their old ways. And we'll see this pattern again as the people continue to travel and as they enter the land of Canaan. This continued theme of not being able to actually live Torah and therefore not to live this covenantal relationship and agreement with God will continue to occur, and it will continue to be a major problem. Indeed, in many ways, weeks 3 and weeks 4 of our class will be us recounting all the ways in which people don't live Torah and all the problems that generates for them. So this sets the stage for trouble to come. But we do move on. After chapter 32, we are able to move on. As I said, a new set of tablets is created with a new copy of the Ten Commandments. And the remaining chapters are going to focus on a little bit more law. And they're especially going to focus on the creation of some of the physical implements that people will use to worship God. First, the Ark of the Covenant, which is a box that the 2 tablets of the law will be placed in so that they can be carried. Firstly, because stone tablets are heavy and hard to carry. You don't want to give the tablets to one guy to put in his backpack to carry around. So they create a box with rings on the side that you can run long poles through so that 4 men can then lift this box up onto their shoulders and carry this box forward with them, right? There are no trains, airplanes. They've got to carry this thing wherever they're going. But it's also a way to show the ritual importance of these tablets, right? These tablets contain the summary of the law, this new covenant between them and their God. And their God doesn't have a statue that you worship. Their God doesn't have any particular place you have to be to worship the God. But this covenant is such an important relationship, and the tablets are a symbol of that covenant. So they are treated with a sort of sacred or holy status. So the ark is a way to carry them. It's also a way to set them apart and make sure that people respect them. But they also need a place to worship, and they're on the move, right? So it makes no sense to build a temple out of wood or stone. So they basically create a tent that they can carry with them and set up wherever they are, the tent of meeting. It's a mobile temple. It's a tent temple. And they also have to create a lot of the furniture that will go inside. The ark will be placed inside when they worship there, but they also need things like a table for the bread that will be offered, an incense burner, lampstands, that kind of thing. And just think about some of the things we might have here at St. Augustine's. We don't have as much liturgical furniture as some other Episcopal churches, but we do. We have this lectern. I'm actually using it right now. We have an altar. We have candles. We have a processional cross, right? People like to have items that help them to engage in communal worship. So they need to create that thing. They don't have it. They have to make it new. And so Exodus actually explains how to make these things, how big they should be, what colors to use, how they'll be constructed, etc. At this time, though, it is just basically a big tent that they carry around with them. Of course, in the distant future, they will be able to build more permanent worship sites, but not yet. And here's an image of some men. These would have been Levites, at least, perhaps particularly priests in the house of Aaron, but certainly in the house of Levi, of Moses and Aaron's family, carrying the ark. So the tablets would be inside this box, and you can see they've at the top there are images of angels, cherubim. Again, just as a decoration to sort of signify this is a holy thing, offer it respect. The box itself, of course, was not worshipped. That was a big no-no, like the calf. But it is nevertheless seen as having a sacred status. And here's one possible guess at what the tent of meeting, the worship space, might have looked like. And you can see it is a tent. Here's the tent pegs that you would tie ropes onto, and some kind of covering here, probably made, I would guess, of wool. And then inside, you create this sort of framework with these wooden frames, and then you would have the ark placed in a sort of kind of the rear sanctuary. But then like the lampstand, here's the bread, the table for the bread of the presence. There would have been incense burners, etc. So they're able to create a little temple or a worship space within the tent as they continue to move. So the remainder of Exodus focuses, for the most part, on explaining how to build this stuff, the ark and the tent, chapters 33 to 40. So again, there's a lot of detailed explanation of carpentry and tent making there. But there is also a further discussion of the law in general, right? The law as a foundation for the relationship between these people and God. And they continue to travel generally north and east towards Canaan, that land that their ancestor had settled so many centuries before. God is slowly leading them back to that place. All right, so we finished with our very rapid overview of Exodus. So for our concluding remarks, the things that I want us to really focus on is, notice that what we learn about God in Exodus, it's kind of two big things. First, God the liberator, God who is the enemy of oppression and exploitation. Right? God comes first to liberate the people. But then secondly, God says, look, now that you're free, you have to figure out how to live responsibly, how to use that freedom wisely. And so the law comes as a way for a free people to live in harmony with each other and with God. And again, I think we Christians should be careful. I think we often look at Torah, we often look at law and see it as a bunch of kind of authoritarian, very rigid rules. And again, we didn't look at law in any detail here. We just don't have the time. But I would encourage you to look into it and to also seek out a Jewish commentary and Jewish understandings of law. And you'll find that there's a richness to their understanding of law that we don't share, and that's fine, but we shouldn't sort of impose our own views of what the law might be back into history or onto other communities. And for many Jewish people, the law is an extremely creative and productive place to go and actually debate issues and to seek that deeper path of harmony in life. Again, harmony with your fellow human beings, as well as harmony with God as the Lord and creator of all things. As I already suggested, the future relationship between this people and God will depend on whether the people can sort of live their half of the covenant. And the spoiler warning sort of message is, in many ways, people mostly fail to do it, as we will see in next week and in our final week, as we review the history of the Israelites as they actually live in the land of Canaan, what will become Israel and Palestine. We will see that it is the inability of people to really fully engage and live Torah that will cause lots of problems in the future.